When people talk about the birth of Yahusha, most of the time they're really talking about December 25th, and they don't even know why. They just inherited it as Christmas, a baby born in a barn with animals, wise men standing over a manger that night. It's all one blended painting in their mind. But if you actually open the text and you actually respect the covenant calendar that Yahuwah gave, none of that holds. The moment you drop Yahusha's birth into the correct feast, the pieces all snap together. The shepherds, the timing, the star, the wise men, the slaughter of the children, even the old Christian idea of completed years, it all lines up when you put him where he belongs. Sakat, the Feast of Tabernacles, and not as a cute symbol, but literally. So let us start with something that most people do not know. The Christian belief of completed years comes from an even older Jewish belief that the righteous live completed years. In other words, the day of their death is the same calendar day as their birth or conception. Early Christian writers took that Jewish idea and applied it to Yahusha. They believed his life began at conception, not just at birth. So they said if he died at Passover, then he must have been conceived at Passover. And if he was conceived at Passover, add 9 months, and that puts his birth at the end of December. That is the logic that eventually gave you March 25th for conception and December 25th for the birth in the traditional church calendar. So the idea behind it is not completely ridiculous, it's just anchored to the wrong calendar and the wrong rhythm. So they were trying to honor his life as a perfect, complete unit without drift, but the problem is that they dragged the idea into a Roman system and stapled it to dates that do not fit the Torah and do not fit the feast and do not fit the text. So we keep the grain of truth and we strip off the Roman crust. Now, let us go to Luke, because Luke gives us an anchor that almost nobody uses properly. Luke chapter 1 does not start with Bethlehem. It starts in the temple. It starts with a priest named Zechariah. He is serving in the course of Abiah with the 8th priestly division, and that detail matters. Those courses are not random, and in the Second Temple period and in the Dead Sea Scroll tradition, those priestly courses rotate on a strict 7-day rhythm inside a fixed calendar. So when Luke says he was of the division of Abiah, that is not just a fun fact, that is a timestamp. So here's the exact picture. The priestly course starts cycling right after the beginning of the year. And in a 364-day covenant calendar year that starts on Aviv 1 from a Tuesday evening to Wednesday evening, we'll just say Wednesday for easy purposes, each course serves for 1 week. Then cycles with festival weeks where all priests serve together. The 8th course, Abiah, shows up around the early summer window. So you get Zechariah serving around Sivan, and he finishes his week, goes home, and his wife Elisheva conceives Yahuanan, John, and Luke tells you that directly. So from that point, Luke says that in the 6th month of Elisheva's pregnancy, the messenger comes to Miriam and tells her that she will conceive Yahusha. So you have 2 clocks running. One from Zechariah's service and conception of John, and one from the 6th month mark where Miriam conceives. So if you track that on a realistic pregnancy range, not a cartoon 9-month exact block, something very simple emerges. Zechariah serves around Sivan, Elisheva conceives soon after. 6 months from that lands you around Kislev, the 9th month, which is December on a Gregorian calendar. So that means that Yahusha is conceived in the dark time of the year, at the hinge where light begins to return. Conception in the womb when the world is at its darkest. That already is prophetic. Then you count forward the normal pregnancy span from Kislev, then you land in the 7th month, Ethanim, the month of Sakat, the Feast of Tabernacles. So without any mystical tricks, without gematria, just honoring Luke's text and the priestly courses and a real calendar conception in the Kislev window and birth of Sakat, it all fits perfectly. So conception when the light turns and birthed when Yahuwah commands his people to dwell in temporary shelters to remember that he tabernacles with them. It's literally the Word became flesh and tabernacled among them. John was not being poetic, he was being literal. So now, look at what happens when you drop Yahusha's birth right into Sakat and actually honor the feast. First, Sakat is one of the 3 pilgrimage feasts. That means Jerusalem was jammed with people. Every male who could come came. Families traveled. Towns around Jerusalem filled up. Bethlehem is about 6 miles away, so it's walking distance. And now it makes sense why suddenly no room in the inn does not sound like a random hotel crisis. It sounds like what always happens when you have a pilgrimage feast. Everything is full. Every guest room, every lodging space, every spare room in Bethlehem. And if you take manger as a feeding trough in a lower room or attached shelter, then you're looking at exactly what would happen when a young couple arrives late in the cycle of feast crowds. They're a shelter, but not an upper guest room, so they are given the leftover space. And during Sakat, people literally build and live in temporary shelters, booths, Sakat. So the whole point is temporary dwelling. Yahusha enters creation, and his first lodging on earth is a temporary structure during the feast that celebrates temporary structures. That is not random. That is covenant level symmetry. Second, Sakat is the only feast that is explicitly tied to the nations. So look at the sacrifices in Numbers 29, 70 bulls over 7 days of Sakat. That number is not accidental. The ancient understanding is that those 70 bulls represent the 70 nations of the earth. Sakat is a feast where Israel stands in the gap for the nations. It is the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, and it is the prophetic picture of the nations coming into the kingdom to worship the king. Now plug the wise men into that. The wise men, the Magi from the east, Gentiles, non-Israelites, coming with gifts to recognize the newborn king of the Jews. That is not a December Christmas story. That is Sakat theology. So the nations come up to honor the king. They bring wealth, they bring gold and incense, and they bow before him. Isaiah 60 talks about nations and kings bringing gold and incense. Zechariah 14 talks about all nations going up to Jerusalem to celebrate Sakat under the rule of the king. And what do the wise men bring? Gold, kingship, frankincense, priesthood and worship, myrrh, burial, and sacrifice. So they're not bringing baby shower presents. They're bringing royal tribute to a priest king whose destiny is death and resurrection. They are acting out the nations, coming to Sakat and bowing before the king. So when you put Yahusha's birth in Sakat, the wise men do not feel random anymore. They're not just nice foreigners who show up somehow. They become the first fruits of the nations, doing exactly what the prophets said that they would do. Third, Sakat explains the shepherds. So Luke tells you that shepherds were out in the fields at night watching their flocks, not hiding in caves because of winter, not huddled from cold rain. They are out at night in open fields, and that fits an autumn window. It does not fit late December in the Judean hill country. During Sakat, thousands camp around Jerusalem. People sing, they rejoice, they blow shofars, they light lamps. The whole region is alive at night. And the announcement of the birth to the shepherds in the field fits an environment where people are already sleeping in booths, already outdoors, and already looking up. So fourth, the wise men don't show up at the manger. That's church art and not Matthew. Matthew says that they come to the house not the stable. So by the time they arrive, Joseph and Miriam are in a house. He also says Herod ordered the killing of all male children 2 years old and under based on the time he determined from the wise men, which means this. The star appeared when Yahusha was born, and the wise men started their journey based on that sign, but by the time they actually reached the land, Yahusha was already older, but still under 2. So the picture is this. He was born at Sakat, a star sign appears, wise men in the east who were familiar with Hebrew writings and prophecy see it. They recognize that this is the birth of the King of the Jews. They begin to travel. That journey takes time. They arrive months later, likely between 1 and 2 years later, while Herod is still alive and paranoid, and they find him in a house, not a manger. They give their gifts, and then they are warned in a dream and leave another way. Joseph is warned and flees to Egypt with Miriam and the child. Herod, furious that he had been outmaneuvered, kills the male children in that age range. All of that lines up with the birth at Sakat and a star at that moment. You do not need to force the wise men into the same night as the shepherds, because the text never says that. Fifth, let us come back to that completed years tradition. The early Christians grabbed onto that idea that the righteous die on the same date that they're conceived, and that was their attempt to show that Yahusha's life as a perfect whole. They just anchored it to Roman dates and a corrupted rhythm. They said his death on March 25 and his conception on March 25 and his birth on December 25. Now, take that same impulse and anchor it to the covenant calendar. Death at Passover, Aviv 14, which again falls on a Tuesday evening to Wednesday evening, same as Aviv 1, fixing the structure that keeps the 3-day and 3-night model intact and aligned with a Monday evening to Tuesday evening Sabbath and a Wednesday crucifixion before a high Sabbath, aligning perfectly with Wednesday, April 11th, 31 AD, which we'll cover this in detail in the next video. So again, if he is conceived at the same covenant pulse location that he dies, then you are not looking at a Roman March 25th. You are looking at Passover in the spring on the real calendar. Now walk forward in real pregnancy time on the 364-day structure, and you do not land in the winter solstice fantasy land. You land in the fall. You land inside that Tishrei or Ethanim window, and you land in the tight band where Sakat lives. So the instinct was right. They just synced it to the wrong spine. Yahusha's life does form a complete unit. It does begin and end on the same covenant pulse, and it does track from Passover to Sakat on the 364-day grid in a way that Roman calendars can never show. They preserved a shadow of the truth, and this is restoring the structure underneath it. 6. Look at what Sakat itself proclaims about Yahusha. Sakat is 8 days. 7 days of dwelling in booths, then the 8th day assembly, Shmini Atzeret, the great closing day. During Sakat, you wave branches, you rejoice, you remember the wilderness wandering, you celebrate that Yahuwah made you dwell in temporary shelters. You acknowledge that you are not at home yet, you confess that He is your covering. Then on the 8th day, you step out of the temporary structure and stand before Him in a solemn closing assembly that points to eternity. Now line that up with Yahusha. He takes on flesh. Human flesh is a sakah, a temporary dwelling. He is born during Sakat while Israel is literally living in temporary booths. He walks among us for a set time. Then he dies at Passover. He rises, he ascends, and the Ruach is poured out. We become living tabernacles. The nations are drawn, and Sakat becomes the pattern of the kingdom. And at the end, after the millennium reign, you have the true 8th-day reality. New heavens, new earth, no more temporary structures, permanent dwelling with Yahuwah. So when you tell people Yahusha was born at Sakat, you are not just picking a date. You are unraveling the entire blueprint that his birth is the first stone in a structure that runs all the way into Revelation 21. 7th, ask yourself why Herod reacted the way that he did. If the wise men were just random mystic astrologers stumbling through town at Christmas time, Herod would likely shrug. But they are high-level scholar officials. They show up in Jerusalem with the caravan. They say, "Where is he? Who has been born, King of the Jews? We saw his star in the east." Matthew says all Jerusalem was troubled with Herod. Why? Because this is not a private devotional moment. This is a political earthquake. A king born in the house of David in the days when Rome holds the sword, in the land that has a prophetic memory of nations coming to Sakat to worship the king. Herod knows the prophecies, the priests know the prophecies, and the people know the prophecies. So if these men are right, then the countdown to judgment has just started. That is why he overreacts and he kills the children. That rage only makes sense if the birth of Yahusha is plugged into the prophetic calendar and the feast structure that Herod's own advisors knew. Which means this: they did not see his birth as a random baby event, they saw it as a calendar event. So let's plug all this together. When you honor the 364-day covenant calendar, when you respect the priest courses in Luke, and when you keep pregnancies inside real biological ranges, and when you drop conception into the Kislev window, when you drop birth into Sakat and Ethanim, when you let the shepherds be outdoors in autumn and not buried in winter, when you let the wise men come later to a house, not a manger, when you let the 70 bulls of Sakat stand for the 70 nations and then watch the nations bring gold and incense to a Jewish child king, when you let ancient completed years ideas rest on covenant pulses instead of Roman dates, when you do all of that without editing the text, something happens. The story stops looking like folklore. It starts looking like engineering, and Yahuwah did not toss Yahusha into history at a random time. He placed him into his own calendar with surgical precision. Conceived when light returns, born when Israel lives in temporary dwellings, announced to shepherds under the autumn sky, marked by a star that sets sages in motion, visited by the nations in the same prophetic rhythm that Sakat has been preaching for thousands of years, protected from a paranoid king whose fear proves the timing is real. So when people say nobody really knows when Yahusha was born, you are allowed to say, actually, once you restore Yahuwah's calendar, the feast of Sakat fits every single piece and nothing else does. And when religious tradition says December 25th, you are allowed to say that is what happens when you rip the story off the covenant spine and tape it onto Rome. Sakat is not just a nice symbol for his birth, it is the rightful home of his birth on the covenant calendar, and once you see that, you can't unsee it.